guys, welcome to the demonstration. So here I'm going to block in the masses, the same as always. You know, I could cut this out and go, look, you know, I'm going to start with the rib cage and pelvis, but it's good to reiterate these forms, I think, and I've sped this up 2.5 times, so it doesn't take too long. But I'm looking for an egg shape, front and back, chop off the top of the egg, and then dig out the plane break in the back, right, as it turns towards the ribs, and then find that opening on the front and flatten off that area where the ribs turn to cartilage. So, of course, I'm zooming through all of this, but yeah, like I say, the iterations are important. Hopefully, you guys will iterate similarly in your own work, because that's how you get the forms to lock into your head. So with the hips, I'm starting with a bucket shape, chop off the front of the bucket, and then just taper the bottom, and that's most of what we need. You'll need to pull that iliac crest up to get a nice curve on that, and especially with Schiele. He doesn't layer the obliques over the iliac crest as is anatomically accurate. He just finds that bone all the way around, like a little sort of like a belt or like a crown around the hips or something like that. So it's going to be important in this sculpt. The bottom section of the hips here, never that important. Can be a little bit if the leg's extended and that ischium, the bottom portion of the bone, starts to push out. I did have to deviate from these proportions somewhat as I worked into the sculpt. What I had to do was thin them out, or at least I think thin the rib cage out, and that kind of makes sense, right? If you look at Schiele's forms, they're generally fairly elongated and fairly stretched out. So when I had realistically proportioned rib cage in there, it wasn't quite working. Here I'm building the shoulder girdle, which I'm experimenting doing as one piece rather than two. Not a good experiment, I don't think. I think this is the last time I'll do it like this, just because where the clavicle meets the scapula, right, where the clavicle meets the acromion process of the scapula, which is the acromioclavicular joint, that joint operates something like a hinge. So the shoulder girdle is articulated at the sternum, where the clavicle is hitting the sternum, and then at the acromion process. And those two joints don't necessarily work in the same way. Like, you think if you shrug your shoulders up, your scapulas are moving straight up and your clavicles are rotating. Whereas if you rotate your arm upwards, like you're pointing at the sky, then both those bones are rotating. So best to have them separate. And then for the face, same as usual pretty much, just take a sphere, stretch it out a bit, pull the face down. And then here I'm starting to rough in, trying to get some characteristic of the face, just looking at the sharpness of the brow, the sharpness of the cheekbones, the depth of the eyes, and how much the lips point out, and also that the bulge of the frontal eminence, right, the bulge of the forehead. And then as I started to block in forms and block in the hair, I found that quite quickly I found it pretty distracting. So I pushed it up to a certain point and then trimmed it all back. For me, sometimes I just have to do that with the face. So there you go, I'm just smoothing it all out. You basically have two options there. If you don't want to just leave it and have it as a distraction, you either refine it or you smooth it all back. And for me, I smooth it all back so then I can bring the rest of the sculpt up together. But there's nothing bad about doing it the other way. It's just having really refining it, and then that becomes like a calling card for the rest of your sculpt to kind of go hit this level. Now this is a humerus that I'm blocking in. So what we'll see on the humerus, and I think probably we'd see it on the legs as well, but I don't do a study of the legs. But he really flares the bone out at the ends. What's the characteristic of the bone is that it flares out. He's generally dealing with very emaciated figures. This is a self-portrait that he's done. So I'm guessing he wasn't carrying a whole bunch of meat around his bones. And when you have thin people, the limbs look like they flare out at the joints, or they do flare out at the joints because the bones are flaring out. So you imagine this is flaring out. If you just put a couple of bacon strips on that, it's not going to stop it from flaring out the joints. Whereas if you were to just wrap it in thick bits of meat, then suddenly at the joints it might look thinner if you don't have meat at the joints, which is what happens on a muscular person. The joints are tendinous, so there's no meat there, so the joints look thin. And here I've again blocked this in somewhat realistically in terms of going, okay, that's 1.5 heads high, but I've really stretched out the medial epicondyle through there. And but what I realized as soon as I started sculpting was like, no, that needs to be, like, he's really stretching that thing out. Okay, and here I'm experimenting with having the radius and the ulna just as a single block. I'm doing this as a, because I'm conscious of you, my dear viewer, that you've seen me blocking these forms a bunch of times. So I'm trying to find different ways of thinking about it and maybe ways to speed it up and things like that. And I guess as well I'm conscious of something that we've seen in Raphael, and we see it a little bit in Schiele as well when he gets to the forearm, is that he thinks about those bones as a block, as a cube. We don't think about that closer to the elbow area because there's more meat mass there that softens those off. But yeah, and that conception worked okay, by the way. I wouldn't be against using it again. Gets a bit of a pain when you want to pronate or supinate, right? Which is having the radius rotate around the ulna. Good God, just noticed that I think I got those bones the wrong way around. The ulna should be on the little finger side, right? So the ulna should be on the inside, and by the time you get to the wrist, the ulna wants to be small, radius should be big. Wow, yeah, they're definitely the wrong way around. So, well, sometimes these things happen, I guess. Yeah, I wasn't using the specific landmarks that I'd made here for the sculpt, so I didn't notice it. I just noticed it now as I'm doing the narration, because what I used these bones for was just to block in the proportions and then to get me the blockiness to start out. So, yeah, let's move on. So here, as I'm raising the arm, just looking at that scapula winging out, and the thing is with Schiele's forms, they can look kind of wobbly, but as you start to look at them in more depth, you find that they're pretty well thought out, pretty accurate for the most part. So the scapula, for example, through here is going to be acting in a way that we would expect it to. I mean, I think, of course, we can't see it in the drawing, but you know, when I've referenced this with other drawings, I can see he's understanding the movement of the scapula, he's understanding the movement of the arms. So I'm playing this all kind of realistically. So this is where we have some slight pronation, I guess, as he's putting the hand on the back of the head. Would that be pronation? Yes, it would. Yeah, quite extreme pronation actually. Pronation being twisting the palm, so it would face down if you had your hands out straight. And so here, as I'm wrapping the hands around the head, and you can see like the twist that I put in the arm is pretty abrupt and pretty, what would you say, like not really carefully mapped out. But depending on the sculpt, I often will spend quite a bit of time just making sure the bones make anatomical sense. Because, like, yeah, of course you can fake it and you'll get away with it 90% of the time if you fake it well. But if the bones are making anatomical sense, then you're just making life easier for yourself moving forwards. And there's this thing that I talk about now and again, which is like, this stuff is so hard, right? Like sculpting in general is so hard, working from reference, working from imagination, it's all really hard. So make it as easy as on yourself as you can. And yeah, if you're doing a blocking like this, just taking the time to make sure the bones make anatomical sense will make things easier moving forwards. Yeah, I felt like with his left arm, the one that's pointing out straight, I could do kind of whatever I wanted with that. Well, not whatever I wanted. I could do whatever I wanted with the hand, and so I just pretty much kept that pointing out straight. I wanted to stay within these very geometric lines that Schiele likes to work in. And I think that's how he gets away with his forms being so wobbly, by the way. They're constrained within fairly rigid movements for the most part. So I decided I would use a cube for this mass conception of between the belly and the hips. Now, one thing that we see that Schiele does is really break that distance open, right, to really stretch the figure out. So that's going to be like a foot longer than it would be, that distance between the pelvis and the rib cage. And yeah, I thought a cube was a pretty smart conception, but I'm not sure. As I looked more closely into how Schiele does it, he actually has it more like a sphere. and he lets the sides of it bow out. We'll look at that maybe in the demonstration or maybe in the post-mortem. The neck, forward-leaning cylinder as always, and again, just like, so here I'm using it as a mask to kind of just fill in stuff, but also by placing the neck there and relating it to the head, you see there I'm having to shunt the head across because I'm going, well, otherwise it doesn't make sense on my neck. So using kind of your anatomical constructions as a guideline through there can be very, very useful, and that's something that you don't get if you just start from a sphere and start pulling out lines, which is also a way that I like to work. And if I do work that way, then I will often put in some blocks afterwards to double check it. So I do the opposite. I just start free and then I try and make it fit, and I will almost always, when I do that, find something that I can change. Now, the end of this video is just going to be tweaking the clavicle and scapula, just getting them to work, moving them about a bit. And it is worth putting the time into this, like I say, but at the same time, you need to be pretty aware that whatever you do, you are going to change it later on. As you move towards a finish, you are going to see things that need to change. So, for example, his right arm, the arm that is raised, at this point, I was just missing the fact that it's really quite rotated forwards. You know, I've got it pointing out at 90 degrees to the body, and it's rotating forwards more at 45 degrees, and so it's not quite as geometric and architectural as I had it, and I think breaking that a little bit, like you can even see the hair of his armpit pushing forward, so that gives you an idea of how forward and pushed and how rotated that is. So and there are 1,000 things like that you know you can only catch either by being really, really careful at this point, or what I prefer to do is being pretty careful at this point and then correcting it as I see the problems as they come up later on.